So we're looking at these three vehicles here. And we first looked at the Theravada vehicle, which again is based on the Four Noble Truths. And we saw there that the final goal of the spiritual path is nirvana. And we can achieve this goal of nirvana by realizing this no self. And then we looked at the Mahayana vehicle, which has as the final goal enlightenment. And we saw there in the practices that the fundamental ignorance that we need to overcome is this grasping to independent me, independent worlds. And we need to come to realize what's called emptiness. But then we've got now here the Vajrayana or Tantra vehicle. And in Vajrayana or Tantra, and of course here we see the word Tantra, and that word is used of course in other traditions, and of course in Hindu there's Hindu Tantra. So I'm only talking here about what's called Buddhist Tantra. So there probably is some overlap between Buddhist Tantra and Hindu Tantra, but how similar or how different, I don't know. I've not studied Hindu Tantra. So here we're talking about Buddhist Tantra. So Tantra or Vajrayana, as we see in the chart, has the same goal as Mahayana, goal of enlightenment. We develop the same aspiration, of course, of bodhicitta. And here in terms of Vipassana practice, we're realizing the same emptiness. So if that's the case, what's the difference between Mahayana and Vajrayana? And the difference is the level of mind that we are using in the spiritual path. So remember earlier we talked about these three levels of mind. The coarse, subtle, and very subtle. The coarse is the one that's active now. And we said that even within coarse is a whole bandwidth, and that our threshold of what we're aware of is very high, meaning that a lot of mental activity going on we're not aware of. And if we engage in the shamatha practice, we can bring that threshold dramatically down to become more aware of more subtle mental activity. But the Buddhist assertion is that we can, in that concentration or shamatha practice, we can bring it right down below entirely the coarse mind, down to the subtle level of mind. So when we actually achieve shamatha, we are now in that more subtle level of mind. And then we use that level of mind in our Vipassana practice, in Theravada to realize no self and achieve nirvana, in Mahayana to realize emptiness and then achieve enlightenment. So both in Theravada and Mahayana, we're using the subtle level of mind as the platform to move along the spiritual path to nirvana and enlightenment. In Vajrayana or Tantra, what we are doing is we are gaining access to the very subtle mind. This mind is primordial mind, the mind of clear light, given many different names. And we're gaining access to this level of mind and using this as the platform or basis to move along the spiritual path. And because it's a much deeper level of mind, therefore we can move more quickly along the spiritual path. We can accelerate our path to enlightenment. And it's said that in a best case scenario, using Tantra or Vajrayana, we can achieve enlightenment in this very life. How do we do that? Is we see in the chart here these practices called the 2 stages. Called generation stage and completion stage. One big difference between Theravada and Mahayana and Vajrayana is that both Theravada and Mahayana are what's called causal vehicles. Meaning, both of these are looking at the spiritual path from the perspective of the cause. That here we are now, there is the goal of nirvana, there is the goal of enlightenment, these are the practices I need to do to engage to move forward along the path to that goal ahead of me. So we're looking forward on the spiritual path. In other words, looking from the perspective of the cause. Whereas Tantra or Vajrayana has the complete opposite perspective. And therefore it's called the resultant vehicle. Meaning in these two stages practices, we are doing all the practices from the perspective of the enlightened state. And this approach is a little bit sort of used sometimes in sport, we see, that people often mentally go through their routine, imagine they've completed it, and then they do that from that perspective, that they've already completed what they want to do. And that can be a very powerful way of actually accomplishing that. So similarly here, we're doing all the practices from that perspective of the enlightened state. And so in generation stage practice, we usually follow what's called a sadhana, a practice manual called a sadhana. And what we do in this practice is that we begin by arising in the form of what's called a deity, in other words, an enlightened being, and then doing the practice from that perspective. But to be able to do that effectively, we need three things. We need renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness. Because if we don't have these three things, at least at some experiential level, then doing generation stage practice is a waste of time. In fact, it could just be increasing our delusion. Particularly if we don't have this wisdom of emptiness, at least at some experiential level. Because as we're going to see tomorrow, this wisdom of emptiness is that nothing exists independently. Nothing exists from its own side. So in this generation stage practice, the first thing is it's said to arise as the deity, to arise in a fully enlightened form. But then if we don't have this, when we try to do this, then we'll be probably doing something like, thinking like, okay, now I have to pretend to be Tara, I have to pretend to be Chenrezig, I have to pretend to be Manjushri. I'm pretending to be enlightened. If that's what we're doing, we've completely missed the point. Completely missed the point. And then all we're doing is instead of grasping onto this is me, we're grasping onto the deity as me. So we're just increasing our delusion. So to really be able to do this, we really need to have some experience of emptiness, and then literally we arise out of emptiness. Then it can be very powerful. And then we do lots of practices here in that sadhana practice from that perspective. And sometimes includes certain visualizations, sometimes chanting some mantra and doing other activities as well. And the reason we're doing that is that this generation stage practice is preparing us for completion stage practice. Because it's completion stage practice that enables us to gain access to the very subtle mind. And generally in completion stage practice, we do that by manipulating subtle energies in the body. By, in meditation, withdrawing all the subtle energies into the central channel, as happens naturally during the death process. We do that in meditation and bring all those energies to the heart chakra, cause the heart chakra to open, and then rest in that very subtle mind, and then use that to realize emptiness. That's completion stage practice. But again, to be able to do these practices, we need renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness. It's certainly at some deep experiential level. Because otherwise, if we don't, then generation stage practice, at best, is we're just wasting our time. At worst, we're just increasing our delusion, thinking we're really enlightened. If we try to do completion stage practice without this as a basis, then again, at best, we're wasting our time. At worst, we're completely screwing up our mind. And there have been many people dabbling with this, completely screwing up their mind. Because remember, we're working at the subtle body, subtle mind level here, and we had the analogy of yesterday, the rider and the horse. The horse is the subtle energies, the mind is the rider, and if we're trying to manipulate subtle energies in an uncontrolled way, we're completely screwing up our mind. So there have been many cases of people playing around with this and actually creating deep psychological disturbances that years later they're trying to repair. So this is not something to play with. It's like playing with dynamite. But if we have done the basis, we have a qualified teacher, we've gone through a good basis in the generation stage practice and we're ready, and we have a qualified teacher, then this can be very powerful. Only then. If we just dabble with it, I think we're basically playing with our own mind in an uncontrolled way. I think that's not a good idea. And I personally know some people, friends, who've done that and have really screwed themselves up badly.
Sorry, would a quick example of that be like, say you really like chocolate, but you know chocolate makes you violent or it makes you act in a different way, so you don't want to do it, but then because you've gone through all this, you're like, oh no, actually, let me just have it in just a little bit in moderation, that'll be alright, because I'm showing self-control, and so that's fine, I'll just do a little bit in moderation.
I'm not sure that analogy fits. But like, for example...
Give an example.
Yeah, I'll give an example. A couple of years ago in the intro course, I was talking about this, and then after class, one person came out and said, oh yes, actually my friend did this. They were in Dharmkot, and there was a 5-day Kundalini awakening workshop. And his friend went, and he said that they were pushing him to have some sort of experience, and he did. So Kundalini is, of course, more in the Hindu term, and it's some very strong, subtle energy. And if you awaken it, you can get a lot of bliss or something. But he wasn't ready, but he managed to do something because they were pushing him, and he had some experience. And then his friend, he said he became completely delusional after that. He said he thought he was God. And he's so far gone that his parents had to fly out to India to get him, to take him home. He was that far gone. So this is not something to play with. Okay. So therefore, sometimes Vajrayana is called the secret vehicle.
I have a question.
Yeah, one second. So it's called the secret vehicle, again, because of these reasons. So historically, you would only ever hear about Tantra from your own personal teacher if you had got the basis and he or she saw that you were ready. Then they would introduce you to these practices, and they first introduce you to generation stage. You'd go off and practice that for some time, and when you had a good basis in that and they saw you were ready for this, then they would introduce you to this practice. So you would be guided very closely by a qualified teacher.
So do you have to be a follower of the Theravada or a Mahayana tradition to be then a follower of the Tantric Buddha tradition? Right.
Okay, good question. So what we actually sort of see here is these are not sort of 3 different paths. These are 3 levels of practice. This is a sort of a foundation level, and then that's the next level, and Tantra Vajrayana is the next level. But does that mean we first have to find a Theravada tradition, and then find a Mahayana, and then Vajrayana? No. Because all the Mahayana traditions as their foundation practices, all of this is included in that tradition. Whatever Mahayana, whether it's Chinese, Zen, Korean, Tibetan, whatever, all of these foundation practices are already included there. And then in Tibetan Buddhism, this is included. In Vajrayana in Tibetan Buddhism, then this is the basis for that. So in Tibetan Buddhism, all of this is included. So therefore, like in Tibetan Buddhism, you have all of these three levels in one system. And my understanding is that Tantra Vajrayana in India only really started to become widely practiced from about the 7th, 8th century onwards. And by then, Buddhism had spread to most countries except Tibet. It only started to spread in Tibet from the 8th century onwards. So what spread into Tibet was a lot of this as well. So I think in the modern world, in Buddhist traditions, probably Tibetan Buddhism is the only one that has this in a very complete form. There are some other traditions, of course, in Buddhism that have Tantra Vajrayana, but not in a fully complete form. That's my understanding. Yes? Okay.
Yeah, would Theravada practitioners agree with this framework? Like that,
Well,
that Mahayana has like the secret sauce and they don't have it?
Well, I think in some Theravada traditions they say this is not even the words of the Buddha. This is made up by someone else.
Do you mean Vajrayana and Hinayana is the same? Where is Hinayana?
Hinayana is the same, Theravada, same. Okay. So that's all I'd like to talk about Tantra Vajrayana. So they're the three vehicles.
So Mahayana means the greater vehicle and Hinayana means the lesser vehicle.
Yeah, but I prefer not to use those words because we get a wrong idea of that.
Yes, so when I first read about this, I started to wonder, like, how did these terms come into being? And does this not go against the concept of Buddhism?
No, again, it's like stepping stones. It's like first, if we want to go to university, first we go to primary school, then secondary school, then university. It's not like one's better or worse, it's the same path. It's just one maybe goes a bit further than the other, that's all. It's not like inferior versus superior.
Who are the founders of these vehicles?
Founders. Well, you could say in an indirect way the Buddha, because the Buddha taught all of this, and then these various traditions formed from the various teachings that spread throughout India and abroad and in other countries. Because the Buddha taught according to people's capacity. And he taught this to this person, that to this person, this to this person. And then from that, when it started to spread, what you find in ancient India, even before it spread out of India, you have philosophical systems being formulated based on the different teachings. I mean, we won't go into these philosophical systems because it's a bit beyond this introduction course. But then that's where it spread out from there.
So was the Buddha actually the first enlightened person?
No. Well, on this planet, it said yes, but of course, historically, if we keep going back, no.
Could you explain the second completion again, please?
Second, what, sorry?
Completion?
Completion?
Yeah.
Completion stage, again, is about manipulating subtle energies in the body to cause the very subtle mind to become active in meditation.
Well, can I confirm?
Yeah.
Can I confirm the manipulation of the subtle body energy to enable very subtle mind to be active?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we have to withdraw all the subtle energies into the central channel, bring them all to the heart chakra, dissolve them there, then the very subtle mind can become active. In general, in the spiritual path, we can talk about sort of two wings of practice. in Sanskrit they're called prajna and upaya. Prajna, as we've seen, means wisdom. And upaya, often translated in is as something like skillful means or method. And so upaya is about, skillful means or method is how we engage in our activities. And of course, underlying motivation for all of our activities is to be one of compassion. So often this second wing is called the compassion wing. So we often see that the two wings of practice are wisdom and compassion. And we need to practice these both. Just like a bird needs two wings to fly somewhere, likewise, if we want to move along the spiritual path, we need both wings of wisdom and compassion. And unfortunately, often people who come into the spiritual path tend to gravitate to one or the other and neglect the other one. And then they get themselves into trouble. For example, in all the Buddhist traditions, we hear about the fact that we need to do Vipassana practice or Vipassana practice to overcome mental afflictions and suffering. So people go, okay, I've got to do that, and jump into that. And they sort of forget about the compassion side. And what often happens as a result is that we can become very self-absorbed. We can become completely disconnected from the world and become very insensitive to the sufferings of others. And in extreme cases, we may feel we're some high-level Vipassana practitioner, and therefore everything I do is with wisdom, so I can do whatever I want. And so they become very unethical. So these are some of the things that can happen if we don't add compassion to our practice. Similarly, some people gravitate to the compassion wing and sort of forget about the wisdom wing, and then they often find themselves in trouble as well. Because if we don't add the wisdom, then what can happen is our compassion can be very biased. I'll help these people because they're nice people, but these nasty, horrible people, in fact, I hope they suffer. And then even if we have a very pure motivation of compassion, we can often end up doing things that not only don't help, but just create more suffering, because we don't know how to help, because we're lacking the wisdom. And then what we often see is that people who naturally have a lot of compassion and want to go out and fix and heal the world, and we see this a lot in aid workers and social workers, full of enthusiasm, full of compassion, go out, and within 3 to 6 months, compassion burnout. So this is a classic example of compassion without wisdom. Here, of course, the wisdom of knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, and the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. And what often happens in this case is because people burn out and suffer, they think, this compassion doesn't work. I give up. Compassion always works. What's not working is a lack of wisdom. So rather than give up compassion, just add wisdom. And then there's another thing that can happen if we only do compassion and not wisdom, and I think all of us have experienced this on many occasions, is we try to help someone and they take advantage of us. And then again, when people do that and they're constantly taken advantage of, again they think compassion doesn't work because I'm just suffering, and they give up. Again, compassion always works. What's not working, again, is a lack of wisdom. Because actually, if we allow people to take advantage of us, that is the opposite of compassion. Because in some ways we're encouraging them to behave badly. And compassion is about helping them to overcome bad behaviour and suffering. So if someone is trying to take advantage of us, The compassionate thing to do is not tolerate that. Of course, not do cognitive fusion and get angry at them and attack them, but be very firm about that and say, I will not tolerate that behaviour. That is the compassionate thing to do. But that comes with wisdom, of course. So therefore, if we practice wisdom and compassion together, then we won't veer off to these sort of extremes and have a lot of problems. And so, of course, all Buddhist traditions practice wisdom and compassion together. So in the foundation level, Theravada level, the wisdom wing we saw was these 3 marks of existence. To come to realise impermanence, suffering and no self. And at this level, the compassion wing is what's called the 4 Immeasurables. In Theravada, these are often called the 4 Brahma Viharas. In the Mahayana vehicle or traditions, what we've briefly seen is the wisdom wing is this wisdom of emptiness. And in the compassion wing, the Mahayana builds on these 4 immeasurables to what's called bodhicitta. So what I'd like to do now, for the rest of today and all of tomorrow, is to look at these 2 wings of wisdom and compassion. And so what we're going to do today is we'll look at the 4 immeasurables now. We'll look at bodhicitta this afternoon, and then tomorrow we'll start by looking at these 3 marks of existence in a little bit more detail, particularly this idea of no self. And then the rest of the day we're going to spend on emptiness. I'm just trying to understand it and how to practice it. So that's the topics now for the rest of today and tomorrow. Any questions about that? Yeah.
What if I decide that I want to accelerate on my path of enlightenment first and then help everyone else? So keeping a minimum compassion to myself and not wasting my time or
If we want to really help others, we need to have 100% compassion for ourselves. 100%. Because we need to take care of ourselves if we're going to help others. If we don't, we're going to do the compassion burnout. It's being selfish if I do something for myself. I'm only going to do minimal things. I'm only going to help others. And we see what happens when people do that. 3 to 6 months, they're completely destroyed.
So if only for self and not like bothering with others.
Again, what we're going to see in the 4 immeasurables here is what we're trying to do is develop these healthy aspirations of loving kindness and compassion and so forth. And then depending on our ability and conditions and what's going on, we implement that in whatever practical way. So it's not so much about how much time we spend on me versus them or so forth. It's about developing the healthy attitude, and then the rest will take care of itself. If we have time and energy and so forth to help people in with a lot of time, great. If we don't, then we spend more time on ourselves. But we need a balance. We need a balance of inward development and outward expression. And how that balance looks for us as an individual will shift from different periods of our life. You may find at a certain time in your life that the best thing to do now for others is actually to spend more time developing myself. But our motivation is I'm doing this so that I can help others more. Of course, if we're doing it going with the motivation, I don't care about others, I'm just going to look after myself, then that's selfishness. But we can spend significant time developing ourselves on the basis of a motivation, I'm doing this now so that I can be much more effective in helping others. For example, if we wanted to go out and heal the world, should we run out there and start putting bandages on people? Or maybe we should go to medical school for 6 years to become a doctor and then go out and really be much more effective in helping people? Which one would be better? I'm not saying everyone needs to be a doctor, but what I'm saying is that you may decide, for me as an individual, the best way I can help is to go off to medical school for 6 years where I'm not really helping very much at all. So then I can spend the rest of my life out there really helping in a much better way. So we have to make those decisions. But as long as we have that motivation underlying there, then depending on, again, individual and conditions and ability, we balance those two things. And that balance will shift from time to time. But if we keep that motivation pure, then the rest will take care of itself.
Meditation's role in being more compassionate? Does meditation play a
Of course, I mean, like every practice, we have to do two things. We have to internalize. I mean, as long as compassion is just words, you know, I want to help others be free of suffering. If it's intellectual, I think we're probably not going to do much because, I mean, it involves challenges, involves our mind, our ego will go, oh, I'm not doing that, that's too difficult. They can look after themselves. I don't care about that. But if we bring it inside, then we shift our attitudes and our habits. Then it becomes much easier. So let's start now by looking at these four immeasurables. So the first of the four immeasurables is loving kindness. In Sanskrit, Maitri, in Pali, Metta. And loving kindness, in general, is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. So it's the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. So therefore, I think it's better to translate Maitri or Metta as loving kindness rather than as love, as sometimes is the case. Because love for us is definitely an emotion and it often implies some sort of intimate behaviour. But here, Maitri and Metta is not an emotion, it's an aspiration, it's a wish. It's an aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. And of course, the word immeasurable is talking about immeasurable living beings. In other words, all living beings. So immeasurable loving kindness is the wish or aspiration for all living beings to be free, to have happiness in its causes. And then we have compassion, which is a translation of the Sanskrit and Pali term karuna. And compassion is the aspirational wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So what we see here is that compassion, like loving kindness, is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's a wish. Aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So, of course, immeasurable compassion is the wish or aspiration for all living beings to be free of suffering and its causes. So I mentioned just now this thing, what we call compassion burnout. Actually, technically, that's impossible. Actually, there's no such thing as compassion burnout. What it really is empathy burnout. Because empathy is the emotion that precedes compassion. And I think sometimes empathy burnout is called empathic distress. And what happens, of course, is that particularly if our view is that the source of suffering is out there, if we have that view with a lot of empathy, then we see no hope. No hope. All this suffering and no hope. So empathy plus no hope equals burnout. If we shift that view, understand the real underlying source of suffering is within our own mind and everyone's mind, then we have hope. We can overcome suffering. So then empathy plus hope leads to compassion. Because compassion, I mean, we wouldn't have a wish or an aspiration for ourselves and us to be free of suffering and its causes if we felt that that was impossible. I mean, what's compassion then? It's just words. It doesn't have meaning. But because we understand that we really can overcome suffering and its causes, because we understand the source of suffering is within our mind, then when we have empathy, then with that wisdom, understanding that, then that will lead to compassion, not to burnout. Now, with these two qualities, it's very much recommended that we cultivate them in stages. So usually in the text, 4 stages are mentioned. First, we cultivate loving kindness and compassion to friends because it's most easy. Then we expand that out to include so-called strangers. And once we're comfortable there, we start to expand out to the difficult people, the so-called enemy. And then eventually we can expand it out to all living beings. But I think in the modern world we need to add one more step at the very beginning, and that is to cultivate loving kindness and compassion toward ourselves first. This normally, or very often, isn't mentioned in the old texts, because I think historically people tended to feel okay about themselves, but in the modern world that's not the case. In fact, there seems to be an epidemic of low self-esteem and even self-hatred. So that's where we need to start. We need to first cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves, and then we can expand out to others. And of course, certainly when we come expanding out to the difficult people, to avoid that cognitive fusion, because otherwise if you have cognitive fusion, there's no way you're going to be able to develop loving kindness and compassion to them. In fact, you'll have the opposite thing. You'll say, I hope they suffer, they deserve to suffer, because they're bad people. So rather avoid the cognitive fusion, and then we can really expand out to all living beings. So that is loving kindness and compassion very briefly. The third one is empathetic joy, or mudita, in Sanskrit and Pali. And this is really a rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good fortune. So basically it's a rejoicing in the positives of ourselves and others. And this is something, particularly in our modern world, is extremely important. Because in our modern world we have this obsessive focus on the negative, and generally with cognitive fusion. So we end up with a fixed, biased view of ourselves and others. And so to help have a more balanced view, first of course is stop the cognitive fusion, but then also to focus on the positives of aspects of ourselves and others, and to rejoice in that. And also empathetic joy is very helpful for overcoming jealousy. Because if someone else has something good happen, we often become very jealous of them. So rather than that, we can be happy for them, we can rejoice in their good fortune. And then the last of the 4 immeasurables is equanimity. In Sanskrit, upeksha, in Pali, upekha. And equanimity is an impartial, unbiased attitude towards others. Now our attitude towards others tends to be very partial or biased. And we often tend to categorise people into 3 groups simply from the perspective of how they seem to affect us. Those people around us who seem to support me in my happiness, we tend to label as friend. Those people around us who don't seem to affect us in any way, we tend to label stranger. And those people around us who seem to interfere with me and my happiness and seem to be even causing me suffering, we tend to label the so-called enemy. And then, of course, the group we've labelled friend because they seem to be the source of our happiness, we end up with a lot of attachment. The group we label strangers because they don't seem to affect us in any way, we often become very apathetic and indifferent towards them, couldn't care less what happens to them. And then the other group we've labelled enemy because they seem to be interfering with me and my happiness and seem to be causing me suffering, we often end up with, of course, aversion, hostility, anger, hatred. So equanimity is about overcoming that. It's about overcoming attachment to friends, apathy to stranger, hostility, anger, hatred to difficult people. And we can begin to do that by, again, avoiding the cognitive fusion, of course, but to understand that we're all in the same situation. We're all wanting to be happy. We're all wanting to be free of suffering. We're all equal in this regard. And then through that to develop this sort of sense of closeness to everyone, that we're all stuck in the same situation, trying to be happy, trying to overcome suffering. And so that's equanimity. And it's equanimity that allows us to cultivate the other 3 qualities out to all living beings. So this is a very brief introduction into the 4 immeasurables. Any questions?
Can you repeat number 3?
3, yeah. Empathetic joy is really a rejoicing in the virtues and good fortune of ourselves and others.
How can you overcome that if this empathy with no hope, like if you look at war-torn areas or stuff like that?
Sorry?
If you have empathy and no hope, if you look at war or any kind of difficult situation in life, how can you cultivate the hope?
Because we can understand that war comes from attachment, hatred, and all of these mental afflictions. I mean, that's why people end up going to war, because they don't like those people, or those people are taking their things, or I want their things, or whatever. So it's these mental afflictions that are leading to the wars. And then if we can understand that what we're going to see tomorrow is that, well, actually mental afflictions is something that is possible to reduce and eliminate. And so then there's hope. I mean, can we do it overnight? Maybe not, but there's hope that we can do that.
But you really have to have hope in others actually to try and also work on themselves, right?
Right, but I mean, the thing is, if we then try to counteract war by killing other people, then we're just ending up as part of the problem, and then there's no hope. I mean, that's what we see often, There's some dictator somewhere who's killing their own people, and then someone else says, let's liberate the people, and then they kill and then they go in power, and then they end up doing the same thing. Because they also have the mental afflictions in their mind, and so their power corrupts their mind, and then they also become the next dictator. And so then the cycle continues. But if we can start to educate people and really to make a change in the world, I mean, it really needs to happen as in the education system. I mean, Does our education system teach children anything about values and dealing with mental afflictions? I don't think so. And so that's a tragedy. I mean, no wonder, you know, the kids now coming into the world, particularly with all the things going on in the modern world, they're completely unprepared for the modern world. And that's why, of course, now teenagers coming into the world, into the workforce and stuff, are having a lot of much more mental issues in depression, anxiety, and all of these things, because the education system does nothing to help them with that. But if we could just change the education system, then I think in the next generation you may find a very different planet. So then there's hope. There's hope.
Where would you start with applying this to the educational system?
I'm not into education system.
Where do you think?
Well, again, you have to, I mean, you know, it has to sort of go at the top level, you know, so we have to sort of, the ones who are sort of controlling the education system, we need to get them to change their mindsets, you know. And slowly, you see some change, you know, that there are some schools and so forth that are really starting to bring in mindfulness and about empathy and compassion. I mean, it's slowly coming in, but I think we need to do a lot more quick, because I think that unless we do that very quickly, maybe we're going to destroy the planet, I think.
Time is running out.
Time
is running out.
Exactly.
The compassion, how would you describe it? The compassion?
So remember again, compassion is not an emotion. So compassion is not about sitting there smiling and saying nice things. This is not compassion. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. But again, to be able to develop that, then of course we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how do we eliminate those causes. If we don't know those three things, it's just words. It has no meaning. May you be free of suffering and its causes. I mean, if we don't know what suffering is, we don't know what the cause of suffering, we don't know how to get rid of the causes, it's just words. It has no meaning. So suffering, of course, here in compassion, is not just physical and mental unpleasant experiences. So we saw that at the deepest level, what we're wishing is for ourselves and others to be free of the potential for suffering. And that is basically the wish to be free of mental afflictions and distorted view of reality. And so if we understand that, and then we understand we can eliminate this distorted view of reality through Vipassana practice, if we understand that, then compassion has meaning. Because then we know what it is, what are the causes, and how to eliminate them. Then it can have meaning.
You spoke about jealousy for the empathic joy. Can you?
Yeah. So often, you know, if someone else has something good happen to them, we're often very jealous of them, particularly if we feel like we deserve that. So rejoicing or empathetic joy can be an antidote to that, is to be happy for them, that they've got those things. So it's like the opposite, it's an antidote to jealousy.
Basically, if you want to help people, you have to make them meditate. If you want to help people, you have to make them meditate.
No.
You say that another practice.
So what you have to do, I mean, what we do is we try to educate them and help them understand that if they're engaging in harmful behaviour, that it's harmful. And then as part, I mean, we have to help people at their level. You know, there's no point going to a person and going, stop, you need to meditate. I mean, I don't think that's going to work. Is it? I mean, unless someone's ready already, that for a few people that may be useful, but I think most people that go away. You know? And very often, if people are very closed-minded, then often the only way we can help initially is to lead by example. Lead by example. And then they'll see that, you know, you're becoming a kinder, more compassionate, a better person. Then they may start asking you, well, what are you doing, you know? Then you have then the door's open. But if you try and stuff something down their throat, you know from your own experience, if someone tries to force something onto you, even if it's the best thing for you, usually we reject it. don't we? So we don't want to do that. You know, if they're open, then if they're open, you can give some advice. If they're not, lead by example.
I think I misunderstood the fourth one. So you have to have the similar attitude towards everyone. Even like, for example, it's my family and they're strangers, it should be the same.
Very good point. Equal attitude, not equal time or equal behaviour.
Oh, okay.
Very different. Unfortunately, and actually that'll come up in the next topic now, is, see, actually in Buddhism, what we've seen here and we saw with actually anger and attachment, we haven't talked actually about emotions at all. Because what's important is not the verbal and physical emotions that are displayed, it's what's underneath. What's driving that? Is it anger, attachment? Is it compassion, loving kindness? So that's the important level. What the verbal and physical display is not the important thing. So actually, in these sort of discussions, you won't... Actually, I think in Tibetan, there is no word emotion. It doesn't exist. But there's mental affliction, and then, of course, there is the qualities. But even here, these are not emotions. They're aspiration or a wish. And attachment and anger are not emotions, as we saw yesterday. So the key here, then, equanimity, is, again, this is attitude. This is basically equal attitude towards others. And then based on that, remember we're talking about then not having attachment to friends, not apathy to strangers, not aversion to difficult people. Then on that basis, then regardless of whether it's a friend, a stranger, or a difficult person, we can interact with them with loving kindness and compassion. Instead of attachment with friends, couldn't care less what happens to people, and then anger and hatred to difficult people.
What was the explanation for equanimity? You read out something when you started.
Equanimity is like an impartial, unbiased attitude towards others. Now, actually, on this point here, and this is my last topic for this morning, is each one of these four immeasurables has what's called a near enemy. So there's what's called a far enemy and a near enemy. A far enemy is what's diametrically opposite. So what's completely opposite is very obvious. So that would be like in a battle, the far enemy is you see them, you see that they're the enemy. The near enemy would be, in a battle, would be someone who infiltrates your camp, pretending to be one of us when they're actually an enemy. And so then they undermine us. And so similarly here, in the four immeasurables, each one has what's called a near enemy, which often can infiltrate and undermine that quality without us knowing. And then it contaminates that quality. So it's important to identify the near enemy, and if it starts infiltrating, to do something about it so that our quality doesn't get corrupted. One of them we've come across already. And that is, we looked yesterday at attachment. That attachment can often feel like it's loving kindness because we really are connected to that person. So the attachment can come in and pollute and corrupt our loving kindness. And of course, the more that it comes in, the more it will derail loving kindness. Now, fortunately, one of the other four immeasurables can act as an antidote to the near enemy. So if we see that our loving kindness is simply degenerating into attachment, then it's good to reflect on equanimity. Because remember, equanimity is about not only overcoming attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, but also aversion to difficult people. Equanimity itself also has a near enemy. So remember, equanimity is a impartial, unbiased attitude, equal attitude towards everyone. But we could simply be equally apathetic to everyone and think we have equanimity. Because I couldn't care less about anyone. I'm equal with everyone. Couldn't care less about anyone. So of course this is not equanimity. This is like apathy or indifference. So if we see that our equanimity is simply degenerating into being equally apathetic or indifferent to everyone, then it's good to reflect on compassion. Because it's difficult to remain indifferent to people when you see that they're suffering. Compassion also has its near enemy. And here I think there's the sort of two near enemies really. One is piti. Because if we see others suffering and we have this piti, what we're really doing is putting ourselves above them. You know, poor you. I'm okay, but poor you. And if that's happening, then I think, again, equanimity can be very helpful. But the other one, of course, is this despair. That and what's happening often here is we're completely focusing on the negative all the time. So we just get too much. So then what's happening if it's degenerating into this despair, then to focus on the positives. So that's, of course, empathetic joy. Despair means like it's just all I see is suffering. It's hopeless. It's too much. And we see this unfortunately in the media. That in the media, I mean, it's all doom and gloom. In fact, they did a study recently it was a big city in the US, and they asked people they asked them about over this 5-year period whether or not things like crime, violence and so forth had increased, stayed the same or decreased. And all the measures like crime, violence, rape and all this sort of thing, robbery and that, they pretty well all of them said it was getting worse. Where actually statistically everyone was getting better, was reducing. Statistics show. But their perception was they were all getting worse because there's so much focus on the negative. So we really need to focus on the positive opposite, otherwise we will slide into this despair, thinking it's all doom and gloom when in fact it's not. Empathetic joy also has a near enemy. And remember, empathetic joy is a rejoicing in the virtues and good fortune of ourselves and others. But what can happen is that rejoicing can degenerate into very meaningless rejoicing. In fact, even to the point of rejoicing when we see others suffer. So if we see our rejoicing is really becoming very meaningless, then it's good to reflect on loving kindness. The wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes, to overcome that. So these are the 4 near enemies and how we can overcome them using one of the other 4 immeasurables. Which means, of course, if we are practicing all of these 4 immeasurables, then inbuilt is it'll help to avoid going to these near enemies. Whereas if we only practice one, then the near enemy is more likely to arise. Any questions?
What about issues like climate change generate a lot of despair?
Again, and of course climate change is a big issue and we need to address it, but it seems like no one is addressing it, where actually that's not true. I mean, there are things going on to address it, so it's like we feel like there's nothing going on, it's completely hopeless. I mean, it's of course a very difficult situation, but actually if you looked at all the things that are being done in various countries for climate change, you'd be actually quite amazed. Because you go, really? I haven't heard about that. So then that gives us some hope, and then we can feel like, okay, let me also be part of that. Whereas if we think it's hopeless, we'll just give up. Whereas if we see what other people are doing, and there's a lot going on, of course much more needs to be done, then that generates some enthusiasm and hope in us, and we may then go out and say, well, I'll contribute as well. And if we all did that, then maybe a lot more people will contribute, whereas I think now many people don't because they think it's a lost cause, because they think it's all bad news, when in fact it's not. An example of equanimity? Well, it just means that the example is that whoever we meet, to understand that they're just like us. They're also trying to be happy, trying to be free of suffering. You know, Dalai Lama's always saying that, you know, we're all one big family on this planet. So if we have this idea, I think this would be very helpful. Of course, that doesn't mean we need to accept what everyone does. I mean, even family members, we need to sometimes correct them. But if we have that sense that we're all one big family on this planet, then let's work together, let's help each other to try and avoid destroying the planet.
Why did you say that pity is the enemy of compassion?
Near enemy.
All right.
Well, pity is sort of elevating ourselves.
Why?
Well, that's the feeling it has. It's a little bit like, I read recently the word sympathy. Apparently, a couple of hundred years ago, sympathy was a very positive term. But now, over the last couple of hundred years, it's sort of changed in meaning. And it's a little bit like pity now. Sympathy is like, poor you. And it's sort of putting ourselves above people.
But why? Why do you say that when you feel pity, you put above other person?
No, I'm just saying that in general. I'm not saying, maybe if you feel that and you don't, that's great. But what I'm saying is in general, when we hear the word pity, how it's often understood in the modern world, and maybe it was different before, like sympathy, it was more this. But now it seems to be more like this.
Okay.
I
So
mean,
what you mean is what we socially call pity.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I read someone who did some research, and he said that basically the word sympathy now tends to be like this. We're sympathetic, but it's more like, I'm okay, you're not okay. But I'm sympathetic to you, but we're putting ourselves above a bit. Whereas I think he said that 200 years ago it didn't have that connotation. It was really same level.
I heard something similar as well, just to that point about the word lucky. Like, so if you're counting yourself as lucky, like, oh, I'm so lucky, you're elevating yourself, when in fact you should feel just grateful, because being lucky, you're seeing people as lower, having less than you, if that helped.
Yeah, I mean, words are very powerful, and so it's good to be selective on the words we use, yes. And sometimes we don't realise, do we? You know, I'm lucky, and then you think about it, oh yeah, I am, I'm doing that, aren't I?
Just a technical question. When you said before, immeasurables, loving kindness and compassion, aspiration for all living beings to be free of what?
Well, in compassion is free of suffering, and loving kindness to have happiness in its causes.
What Buddhism says about gratitude?
Gratitude, yeah. And I think gratitude really comes with this empathetic joy, is to really rejoice in that. I think this is something also very important. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that probably on the last day, but what can be very helpful here in a practical way, and then we'll need to finish on that note, is, we talked about this purification, these 4 opponent powers yesterday. What can be very helpful here in a very practical way is, at the end of the day, before we go to bed, to do a review of the day. How did our day go? And pick one negative thing we did during the day, just one, and go through these 4 opponent powers: regret, reliance, remedy, resolve. Yeah? But equally important, maybe even more important, is to go review our day and pick one good thing we did, and then do this empathetic joy. Is to rejoice, not in ourselves, that's cognitive fusion, to rejoice in that activity and make a strong determination to continue to do that the following day. But in addition to that, is review our day and then have gratitude for one thing we received during that day. Because we tend to take things for granted. And we receive a lot every day. A lot. And we don't realise that. But if we start paying attention to that, we can have a lot of gratitude. And that can really also be very uplifting on the positive side. So to overcome this heavy negative bias we have, then the rejoicing, one good thing we did, and gratitude for one thing we received. I think these are key at the end of every day, at least. Okay, let's stop there. Again, a couple of discussion topics before we break for lunch. So this morning in these 3 vehicles, we saw that at the foundation level, the entry point into the Buddhist spiritual path is this renunciation, this aspiration for liberation. So the first question is, to develop renunciation, do we need to change our lifestyle? To develop renunciation, do we need to change our lifestyle? If so, what do we need to change? If so, what do we need to change? The second question is about these 3 vehicles, and that is, what are the main similarities? What are the main similarities and the main differences between Theravada, Mahayana and Vajrayana? So what are the main similarities and the main differences between Theravada, Mahayana and Vajrayana? And the third question is about these 6 perfections practices, the main practices in the Mahayana. And the question is, in what way are each of the 6 perfections important? In what way are each of the 6 perfections important? And the second part of the third question is, why are they presented in this order? Why are they presented in this order? So there's a couple of reasons. They always are presented in this particular order, so see if you can think about why they're presented in this particular order. So let's break for lunch there and come back. I'll see you back at 3:30.